Hey, welcome. We're going to do chapter 16 here to talk about Reconstruction, get the reformation of the country back together. So we just finished the Civil War, or if this is American history 10, the Civil War just ended, and you guys are just now coming into the story. So this is like American history 2, the return of America, or America Strikes Back, or whatever you want to call it. So chapter 16 is Reconstruction, and the nation's been torn apart by slavery and secession, and now we have to rebuild it. And so it's a time period in America that lasts from 1865 to 1877. It's really from the end of the Civil War, or if you want to look at it from the surrender of Lee's army at Appomattox to the election of 1876, which is going to lead to the Compromise of 1877 and then the end of Reconstruction. At different points in Reconstruction, we're going to have different leadership. The first one is going to be a period of presidential Reconstruction, which is going to be the period of Lincoln and the period of Johnson. And then we're going to have radical Reconstruction, which is going to be led by the radical Republicans from Congress from 1867 to 1877. Presidential Reconstruction, like we said, is led by Lincoln and Johnson. And the ultimate goal of this is just to end the Civil War and get the nation back together as quickly as possible. Going to do it in any way, do it as quickly as possible. We're not looking to remake the South. We're not looking to do anything other than just bring the nation back together, get all of the states back, the 31 states we have at that time, and move forward. So they proposed something called the 10% plan. Lincoln was behind this. For all the southern states to re-enter the Union, 10% of the voting population of 1860. So that means 10% of people that were eligible to vote in the election before the South seceded from the Union had to pledge allegiance to the United States, and they just had to write a new state constitution, and everything's copacetic. Pretty easy peasy, lemon squeezy. And then we have radical Reconstruction, which is led by Congress. This is going to be after 1865. And the goal is to remake the Southern society. It's really to punish the South for the Civil War and to remake the South. And they come up with this idea like this ironclad oath where everybody that if you participated in rebellion against the Union, then you were forbidden from serving in public office or taking part in politics. I don't know. It's a lot harder. It definitely lasts longer. It has a much greater effect on the lives of African Americans and poor whites in the South. I would argue that radical Reconstruction was the way to go here to bring about change. But it all depends on your interpretation of the Civil War, which we'll get to here in just 1 second. Okay. So how's this all start? January 1865, the 13th Amendment passes Congress. It's sent out to all the states to ratify. And these are going to be states that have not rejoined the Union yet. So these are states in the Union. And this 13th Amendment, of course, is going to end in slavery. April 13th, 1865, Mary Todd Lincoln sitting there having dinner with Abe. And she's like, Abe, would it kill you to take me to the theater once in a while? And of course, he takes her on April 14th and is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Andrew, we have a problem there. Andrew Johnson takes over as president. Sorry about that. We'll just go ahead and fix it. Andrew Johnson takes over as president after Lincoln's assassination, and Lincoln passes. Johnson's an interesting choice for Lincoln in 1860, the election of 1864, and the fact that he's a Democrat. Lincoln is a Republican, right? He's a Southerner. Lincoln's from the North. Andrew Johnson was a former slave owner. Lincoln was never. He's always been about the abolition of slavery, or at least the prevention of slavery expansion into the Western states. Johnson was born poor in the South. He makes his own money, which he does. He's similar to Lincoln in that respect. But he's an outsider in the North because he's from the South, and he's an outsider in the South because he was born poor and he doesn't come from Southern genteel society. And so Johnson was chosen by Lincoln for a number of reasons. The first one is just to show unity with that he could work with the South. Here you have a former slave owner, a Democrat, Southern Democrat. We should put him on this ticket. It's like this ticket to heal the nation. It really doesn't do a whole lot because Lincoln is wildly popular in the North by 1864, and and the South's not voting. So we're good there, right? He shares the ideas of Lincoln that secession was illegal, and therefore that the South never left the Union. And this is important. This is probably one of the more important parts of this unit. I'm sorry. Is that Lincoln believed that the South never had the legal right to leave the Union. And so therefore they never gave up their rights. And so they held all the basic rights that were promised to them in the Constitution throughout all of the Civil War. And Lincoln's goal was to restore all of those rights minus their property and slaves following the war. And so, once that was done, Lincoln's core belief was that, hey, this is it. We're finished. The war's over. Everything's good. Now, if Lincoln would have survived, does that belief change? Do we do other things? There's a possibility. I mean, obviously, the Civil War, you see the change of Lincoln from fighting the war to preserve the Union to fighting the war to end slavery. So perhaps Lincoln does make some changes in his philosophies, but we'll never know because April 14th, 1865, Lincoln meets his untimely demise. All right. In May of 1865, Johnson carries out Lincoln's wishes and proposes the Amnesty and Reconstruction Act, which pardons all Southerners who rebelled against the Union, except for like the very high-ranking military officials and the high-ranking political officials. They return all the private property of the South that was seized during the war, minus slaves, and they just ask for an allegiance to the Constitution. And at that point, Civil War's over, Reconstruction's over, and Johnson's moving forward with the nation. The problem is it doesn't solve any of the problems in the South. And one of the problems in the South is the fact that you have 4 million people that have never been to school, that can't read, can't write, have no, I'm not gonna say no skills, but limited marketable skills. And so Congress and the president approve something called the Freedmen's Bureau. They go into the South and they start the transition from slave labor to wage labor. They set up public schools. It's important to realize that in the South, you don't have public schools before this time frame. The very wealthy would have private tutors come in and teach their kids, and the poor would just their kids wouldn't have an education. And so the Freedmen's Bureau actually offers a step up in education to not only former slaves, but also poor whites. So we have that. In 1866, Johnson vetoes the renewal of the funding for the program. Again, he thinks that we're all done, and Congress overrides that veto until 1872. We move forward from there. And they override this veto and they fund the program until 1872 when the Freedmen Bureau goes away. The effects of presidential Reconstruction on the South is this: when the South reforms with no intervention from the North, immediately they try to restore the economy and the social practices of slavery, and they do that through something called black codes. If we've talked in the previous class, we talked about something called slave laws or slave codes, in which there was specific laws that dealt with the enslaved. Like, they couldn't be out, enslaved people couldn't be off plantations. They couldn't be out past dark. They couldn't meet in too big of groups. They couldn't do this. They couldn't do that, right? Black codes basically take those same laws and they just remove the word slave and put in Negro. So all we're doing in the South at this point is just reforming the slave economy, right? Laws restrict blacks from working for multiple employers, and so that means you can't compete or make more money to advance your position in society. It reduces competition, and so allows for low payment of wages. It requires African Americans to be employed, but not only employed, but employed by a white person. So that prevents entrepreneurship, and all of these things are going to basically keep slaves trapped on their former slaves trapped on their former plantations. Okay. Black codes were the cause of Congress passing something called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. President Johnson vetoed this, and Congress overrode it once again. And so the Civil Rights Act gives basic rights to African Americans in the South. The problem Congress sees with this is it's just a bill from Congress, and the fact that bills can be changed year to year. It doesn't matter, right? What is more permanent is a constitutional amendment. And so Congress gets the idea that they're going to pass a constitutional amendment, basically guaranteeing equal protection under law on the state and federal level. And so what the 14th Amendment really does, you have the due process clause, you have the equal protection clause, but really what the 14th Amendment is doing is it's taking all the basic rights of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution and applying them at the state level as well, which today we kind of take for granted. But in 1865, 1866, it was believed that the Constitution only dealt with the federal, and states dealt with individual rights as they saw fit. And so Johnson's opposition not only to the Civil Rights Act and to the Freedmen's Bureau, and then the 14th Amendment just further widens this division between a Republican Congress and a Democratic president, right? And so in 1867, Congress decides they're going to take control of Reconstruction, take it away from the president, and they pass something called the Military Reconstruction Act, which basically divides the South up into 5 different districts. They place a former Union general in control of each district to ensure that things like the 14th Amendment are being enforced, that African Americans are receiving fair and equal treatment. They're having access to schools. They're having access. Eventually, they'll have access to the polls, right? And so this is a huge shift from presidential Reconstruction, where we're just trying to glue the whole thing back together, like a vase that fell over when mom and dad are out, and just trying to get it back together as quickly as possible, to radical Reconstruction when Congress is looking to throw that old vase out and build a new one. Okay, so Congress overrides the president's veto power of this. And the bill requires the southern states to write a new constitution, ratify the 14th Amendment in order to rejoin the Union. And again, this is a huge shift, because this is basically to rejoin the Union. That's what we're looking at there, is the fact that it's a shift from the fact that, hey, states had left the Union. And so if they did leave the Union, this gets us in a weird legal area, because if they did leave the Union, then they had a legal right to leave the Union. And then is the Civil War, War of Conquest and aggression? I don't know. It depends on how you look at it, right? And then also, does it really matter? There's a problem with the way that the enslaved Africans are being treated. The formerly enslaved people, the formerly enslaved of the South, are being treated, and the federal government's going to go in there and change things. So, like, is that point mute? Maybe, but this is what historians are going to look at and argue about. And you look at different parts of the Civil War, it's pretty clear why the North won. They had a larger population. They had the ability to produce more, right? So I mean, that's not much of a historical question, but the historical question really is: do states have the right to leave the Union? If they willingly join the Union, do they have the right to willingly leave the Union? Most people would say no. But then if a state does choose to leave the Union and they come back, should they be punished for that? Well, Reconstruction kind of answers that question for us, I suppose. So Johnson's made Congress really mad, and Congress is mad at Johnson. Johnson's mad at Congress. And Congress is trying to strip President Johnson of any type of power he has. And so they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act, which basically prevents President Johnson from firing somebody from an appointed position. Certain positions in the government require congressional approval. So like the president's cabinet, that would be really the only ones. President's cabinet, or somebody within the executive branch that the president could fire. Typically, it's seen that the president can fire and hire basically whoever he wants to within his cabinet, and Congress is passing this law that's going to prevent him from doing so. In August of 1867, he fires the Secretary of War and is charged with the crime. And so when a president is charged with the crime, we start documents of impeachment. And so to impeach a president doesn't necessarily mean that he did anything illegal. It just means that there's there's a probability that he did. And so Johnson becomes the first president to go through an impeachment investigation. The House of Representatives kind of gets together and they act as more or less like a grand jury. They hear the evidence and then they vote. And it's voted that Johnson did commit a crime, or there's reasonable suspicion that he committed a crime. And so then, therefore, he's impeached. And that case then goes before the Senate, where the Senate sets, they hear all the evidence, and then they act as the judge. And so Johnson does that. He goes before the Senate. You need 2/3 of the Senate. You need a simple majority of the House to move to charge the president, and then you need a 2/3 majority of the Senate to convict the president. And Johnson falls one vote short of being removed from office and convicted. And so at that point, Johnson really has no political power for the rest of his administration. In November of 1868, U.S. Grant is elected president. Grant doesn't really have any political experience. He's won the Civil War. He's very popular. And so he doesn't have the political chops maybe to guide Reconstruction the way that it should. And so he does that. He's part of it, but Congress maintains control. The 15th Amendment is proposed in 1869 and ratified in 1870. That gives African American men the right to vote. This causes a little bit of problems because a lot of the early abolitionist movement was led by women, and it was tied into this women's suffrage movement to begin with. And so a lot of women felt betrayed that African American men were going to be given the right to vote before them, or without them, I suppose. They have a right to their opinion, because it's right. They should have had the right to vote at this point. But the fact that you're giving African American men the right to full citizenship and the right to the ballot box outweighs any negativity or any negative side of the bill that excludes women, I suppose. Women will have to wait until 1920, so they're going to have to wait another 50 years, another generation, before they're given the right to vote. So with African American men being able to vote, the South produces something called union leagues. And union leagues are just these political organizations that are going to help Black or African American men win representation on the political surface. They start to organize the Black vote. They get out, they get people excited about voting. They put quality candidates up for election for offices, and they're going to win. They're going to win lots of seats. They're going to actually, in Mississippi, you're going to have 2 African American senators. You're going to have members of the House of Representatives that are going to be African American. You're going to have lots of local members of government that are going to be Black in the South. Remember, a lot of the Southern states, there's 11 states that leave the Union. Probably of those 11, this is just off the top of my head, don't hold me to it, but I'm going to say 5 of the 11 probably have larger African American populations than white populations. And so you have a larger voting pool if you can organize that voting pool to elect people. And that's what happens in places like Mississippi and Alabama and those types of places. And so this election of African Americans to office really changes the structure of the South. You go from an enslaved people to people that are probably in charge and running the state within 10 years ish, a little bit less. So this is going to change the way society is structured. And then also we're going to see a change in the taxation on property in the South. It used to be in the South that you were taxed on the production of your land. So like if your land produced, I don't know, 4 bushels of cotton or 4 bushels of corn or 4 bushels of wheat or whatever, you would be taxed on those 4 bushels. After Reconstruction, or when a Reconstruction is going on, we change from taxation on production to taxation on property. And so if you own 1,000 acres, you get taxed on all 1,000 acres. And this is a huge change, and it's a huge problem for the South, because just like before the Civil War, the South is a cash-strapped economy. There's not a lot of liquid money in the South. A lot of it's tied up into homes and land and those types of things. It's not It's not part of, like, it's not a cash rich economy, and so whites don't have the money to pay those taxes, and that's problematic. And so that, as well as much as African Americans being elected to political positions, lead to the South, lead to the idea in the South that whites are starting to lose control of the economy, and they're starting to see their hold of the economy slip away. And so it results in two efforts to reassert control. The first one is going to be sharecropping. Sharecropping is basically simple. I own 1,000 acres. I have, I don't know, let's say I have, at one point I owned 100 slaves or 100 slave families, right? I own 1,000 acres. I go out to each one and I'm like, hey, would you guys like to stay on and work on my plantation? I'll loan you, or I'll rent you 100 acres over here. You can grow whatever you want. You can do whatever. And then you can just pay me on taxes. And of course, the majority of time in the South, they're going to grow things like wheat, small amounts of wheat, corn, and cotton. And so I would charge them as the plantation owner, not me personally. I would charge them half of the cotton and probably 2/3 of the corn that they produce as rent, and then they could keep a third to eat of the corn to eat, and then half of the cotton to sell. What that does is it ultimately leaves lots of people in debt. I would also charge them the taxes on the land because I'm not using the land, they're using the land. So then they would pay that property tax for me on the land. I would loan people money for grain. I would loan people money for building materials. I would loan people money for farming materials or whatever. And the idea is that those people can't leave the land until they pay back the debt, but I make the interest rate so high that they can't. And so you keep people trapped through debt. And I would argue that the same thing happens today. I mean, we have student loans, we have credit cards, those types of things that keep people deep in debt. And then you're not able to go explore new options for work. You know, you're not able to, if you're unhappy with your job and you want to start a new job, well, or you want to start a new company, or you have an idea for a company. If you're $300,000 in debt, or like, you know, you're $70,000 in credit card debt, you're not able to go out and do that because you have bills to pay. And so you're stuck in your job and trying to work your way through it, and you don't like it, blah, blah, blah. Versus if, you know, maybe if you don't have that, well, then all of a sudden you could start Apple Computers, or you could start Amazon, or you could start, you know, I don't know, a cookie delivery service that brings me cookies at 2 a.m. when I'm hungry, those types of things. So like, there you go. That would be a good idea. The other method used by whites to regain control in the South is going to be terrorism. And you see the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. Bedford Forrest, who was a former cavalry general in the South, forms a secret organization where they ride around in sheets with hoods to mask their identity, and they intimidate people using violence and threats of violence to prevent people from going out and voting in the polls, from acting out in ways that are going to lead society. All of those things. And so fear and terrorism become a prevalent force in the South, and that's going to reduce African American voter turnout, which is going to lead to a reduction in the number of African Americans that are going to be elected, and going to lead to reduced power and social change for African Americans in the South. By the election of 1876, those two methods had worked pretty well, and the Democratic Party had regained control of the South. The presidential election of 1876 comes down to Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio, and I believe the guy's name is Samuel Tilden from New York. And Tilden probably wins the election outright, but there's 5 states that there's some irregularities, or there's something funny about them, and so Congress forms a committee, and they agree to give all 5 of those states to Hayes. In exchange for this, the Democrats agree to it if military Reconstruction is ended. And so we've removed military control from the South, and the Compromise of 1877 brings an official end to Reconstruction. And we move into the period of Jim Crow that's going to last from 1877 to 1954. And so that's where we are with this first chapter. Hope I didn't bore you too much. Just quick going through those notes. But I will see you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.